Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Atlanta Press Club. My name is Christy York-Wooten. I'm the president of the club. Thanks for being here with us today and joining us for our online Loudermilk Young series event, The Future of Democracy Now, What We Can Learn from Elections. Today, we welcome guests from the Carter Center and Emory University to discuss the lessons of 2020's political season and to wager a forecast for what comes next. Would like to remind you today that if you have questions for our speakers or moderator, please type them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom window there on the bottom right. Thank you for supporting the work of the Atlanta Press Club by joining this webinar today. Please visit atlantapressclub.org to register for our upcoming events. On our website, you may also sponsor an event, join as a member, or donate to the club. Please also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and watch our videos to learn more about the club. All right, let's get started. Today, we've asked Donna Lowry to moderate the program. Donna is an award-winning journalist who is the host of GPB's Lawmakers program, and before that, she spent nearly 30 years at WXIA 11 Alive as one of Atlanta's most trusted reporters. Please welcome Donna.
Hello, I am so happy to moderate this discussion. It's important. We have a distinguished panel, and the great thing about it is so relevant right now with all that we're dealing with. So welcome to the future of democracy now. We know that throughout 2020, Georgia's electoral process took center stage in American politics. In 2021, the spotlight on Georgia, it just continues. Today, we will look back on the 2020 election season to discuss what was learned from observing elections internationally and here in the US. Now, let's introduce our panelists. We are delighted to have with us today in alphabetical order, Dr. Alan Abramowitz, who is the Alvin W. Barkley Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Paige Alexander is CEO of the Carter Center. Dr. David Carroll is the director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center, and Dr. Andra Gillespie is director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. So welcome to all of you. We're excited about this discussion. So let's get started. To start us off, I'd like to turn our attention to the Carter Center's work on elections. And so David, can you give us an overview of the Carter Center's work in observing elections?
Sure. Good morning, Donna. Thank you. It's great to be here, talk to you, and be with the Atlanta Press Club and the other panelists. I look forward to the rest of the discussion. So I think as many people know, the Carter Center has a long history working on elections around the world, actually more than 30 years now. We try to prioritize where we get involved by looking at countries that are going through a difficult transition, trying to strengthen their democracy, or maybe they're going through a moment where they're backsliding. And there's really a challenge to them becoming a strong democratic system. We focus this work internationally, and since 1989, we've been involved in more than 110 elections in about 40 countries around the world, in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East. And this past year in 2020, somewhat typical, where we do a handful of elections every year now. We've had election missions in Guyana, in Bolivia, Myanmar, Cote d'Ivoire, and we also had a project focused on the elections in the United States. And just one other thing, throughout the last 20 years or so, in parallel to this work, we've really focused on trying to develop and build consensus around what are the standards by which we assess the quality of elections.
That's quite extensive. Thank you so much for that. And Paige, for the first time, the Carter Center felt the need to be involved with the US elections. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, it's good to be here with you today. And as David mentioned, while the Carter Center's focus for its election work has always been directed internationally, in 2020, we decided for the first time that it was important to engage in the US elections, especially as we could see what was happening in our own backyard here in Georgia. So the key reason is that as we moved through 2020, through the primary season as well, it became clear to us that the threats to US democracy were really unprecedented, and that the same problems that would cause us to focus on a country internationally, the backsliding in democracies, these were becoming serious issues in the US. And those included four main areas. One, the increasing level of polarization that we saw through the campaign, the growing concerns about the racial divisions and injustice, the fear the election wouldn't be seen as credible or accepted by a large percentage of the American population, and that major candidates might not accept the results, and concern about the potential for violence. So for all of these reasons, we decided it was something we would do overseas, so we should probably be doing it here as well.
Well, we're glad you got involved. And now, David, how did the Carter Center's work in the U.S. differ from the international work? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. So generally speaking, our work internationally is directly observing elections or supporting other election observers. And when we observe elections internationally, we need to have the invitation from an appropriate local authority and be welcomed by the major political parties involved. And in the United States context, that would entail 50 different states involving inviting our participation. And so that's not what we were trying to do in the United States in 2020. Instead, our main goal was to focus on a program of public information, because we were essentially concerned with this kind of lack of trust and lack of confidence. And so we were really trying to underscore trusted sources of information and how we could underscore the importance of trust and transparency. And so we did quite a bit of work in a public information campaign to draw attention to information that citizens and others might not be fully aware of, about timelines for early voting, the processes for absentee balloting, and what to expect in terms of when we would have official, accurate election results in the post-election period.
So I know that, Paige, that the Carter Center observed the audit of the U.S. presidential election in Georgia, which turned into a hand count. You were there. What were your key findings?
Sure. Well, that's correct. While the Carter Center efforts were mostly about providing public information to increase the transparency and trust of the elections that we were all going through, we did decide to observe the post-election audit. And I'll say that originally it was planned to be something called a risk limiting audit. And that would have been based on a sample of ballots for one particular race. But because the presidential race was so close, the Secretary of State's office decided it made more sense to do a full hand tally versus having to pull a large number of samples, 1 or 2 million out of these big boxes, just take the box and count everything by hand. So we did an audit observation for 5 days in mid-November. We deployed about 60 monitors to 25 counties. This accounted for about 2/3 of the votes cast overall in Georgia. We were invited by the Secretary of State's office. We were the only nonpartisan organization monitoring the audit. And it was to provide an independent and impartial assessment of the process. It was the same access that was provided to political party monitors. I was in Fannin County, DeKalb, and Fulton, and so I was able to see exactly what I see when we go overseas with people doing their civic duty and hand counting. So we found that the audit was conducted according to the procedures and without any significant problems, and the audit results were verified the accuracy of the machine recount. So I should note that we were also invited, the Carter Center, to participate in Secretary Raffensperger's task force on safe, secure, and accessible elections as a nonpartisan member. And so that is a continuing process. It's a good feedback loop for the Secretary of State's office to be listening to a lot of different voices. And so we're happy to be on that. We also did a code of conduct around the January 5th Senate runoff election. We drafted this code to hope to reduce tensions and mitigate threats of violence. And we monitored social media to make sure that that was happening. We tried to get all the parties to sign the code and a bipartisan coalition to adopt it. And a number of religious and business leaders endorsed it, as did the Democratic candidates. So this is important areas that we at the Carter Center felt needed to be looked at for transparency's sake. So we are happy to do so.
Very extensive, right in the Carter Center's backyard. Must have been interesting to have that. What I'd be curious from either you, Paige, or David, on what was the most valuable lesson learned from all of this.
Sure, I would say one of the things that we learned, and it's actually not a big surprise, but it just drove home how fundamentally similar the United States is with struggling countries around the world. That democracy is a constant challenge and it requires constant work, and that we're not special in terms of what it takes to have elections that have confidence and integrity. And it really underscored a lesson that we've learned a long time ago in our international work, the fundamental importance of there being public trust. And the key factor involved in building that is transparency and accurate information, that people really understand what's happening. They know there's trusted sources of information, and there's maximum transparency around that process so people can really see it and understand it. I would say that's probably the overarching lesson.
Paige, anything?
No, I
Yes.
think we interestingly enough, today a report just came out from the Center of, I always forget, for the Center for Election Innovation and Research. And it was a new survey of Georgia voters and to better understand the confidence of the state's electoral system. So as we heard so much on air about people not having confidence in the process, and as I'm sure we'll talk about, walking through what are the next steps that the Georgia State Legislature is looking at to rebuild confidence. This report said that 71% of Republicans still had confidence in their vote in early January, and 90% of voters reported confirming the content of their ballot before casting them. These are the things that we look for as an organization to make sure that there is transparency and confidence in the process. So I was really happy to see this report come out today.
Right. We'll all look forward to seeing more about that. So now I'd like to open this question to all the panelists. In the Carter Center's Election Bites series, there was a discussion about how polarization, dehumanization, and disinformation led to violence. That was before the January 6th insurrection. Can each of you talk a little bit about any conflict resolution tactics or strategies we should expect to see employed in future election cycles to avoid these kinds of clashes? Can we get past January 6th at all? Andra, do you want to jump in there first?
Well, we can't get past January 6th until we acknowledge that it happened and understand what the root causes of it were. So there are some people who would very much like to move on. And, even with a month's distance, people want to try to act like it's ancient history. But we can't act like it's not ancient history, one, because it's not. And then two, we also have to collectively, as a community and as a nation, take ownership for the corrosive, toxic, hyper-partisan environment that led to January 6th. And so what that means is that there are going to have to be politicians who are going to have to take responsibility for questioning the results of the election and creating an environment that actually legitimized things that were coming from the fringes of society. It's also going to have to be people who are going to be willing to distance themselves from President Trump. I know we're going through the impeachment trial right now. In political science, we often think about sort of causal arguments. And we understand that it's actually really hard to have sort of cleared lines between X and Y when we think about our independent and dependent variables. But if making incendiary comments and then having people walk down the street and break into the Capitol isn't a causal argument, I don't know what is. That's what we would want to see. We often don't have that type of data at hand to prove it. We do have it here. And what we need are people to put partisanship aside in order to be able to acknowledge that. And then once we have that acknowledgement and contrition, then I think we will actually be in a position to be able to move forward and to unify. But what I hear some people asking for is unity without even confession. And that just strikes me as just untenable.
Alan, I'm curious to hear from you about whether we can get past January 6th.
Well, first of all, I'd like to second what Andra just said. I think what's kind of remarkable when you think about what happened in this election and in light of what David and Paige were just talking about is that when you look at the election itself, I think the election was very well conducted. When you think about the challenges that the country faced in holding this presidential election at a time that the country is going through this terrible COVID pandemic, I think it's rather remarkable that we pulled it off. And by and large, we pulled it off very well. And we had a record turnout. And by all accounts, this was a free and fair election. So that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, that we had for the first time in modern history a president of the United States who refused to accept the results of that election and who was joined in that effort by a substantial share of the leaders of his party. Don't forget, it wasn't just the violent insurrection that occurred on January 6th. The other thing that happened on January 6th that to me was equally concerning is that we saw a large majority of Republican members of the House of Representatives and a fair number of Republican senators who voted to reject the results of the election. And we've seen this continue. So it's that effort by the President of the United States and many members of his party and leaders of his party to raise doubts about the outcome of the election that I think is behind not only the insurrection, but a lot of the concerns that we have now going forward about our ability to conduct free and fair elections and have the results accepted. The key to any, in any democracy, one of the keys is not just the election itself, but accepting the results of the election. The defeated party has to accept the results of the election and allow a peaceful transition in power. If that happens, that's what did not happen in this election for the first time in modern history. And I think that's what we need to be very concerned about going forward.
Thank you so much for that. I wondered if Paige or David, from a Carter Center point of view, if there were any thoughts on getting past January 6th?
Well, I'll say, I applaud what both Andrea and Alan said. I think it's really hard to get past something that is a historic moment for us. And so the question is, where's the equalizer? At what point is it through the rule of law? Is it through the legal platforms? We have to look at this from the Carter Center as to where our interventions could be useful. I think we've probably got three main areas that we're looking at, and I'll let David talk about the training for nonpartisan observation. But I would say we also need to look at building networks of grassroots citizens, like a democracy corps, really to reduce the polarization and the partisan division and develop a nonpartisan observation skills and conducts of civic education. For me, I've seen this overseas and in my time overseas, as well as when you have an informed citizenry, it makes a difference. And to get out of the echo chamber that everyone is in, that each side is in, to actually be talking to each other and to have good civic education is important. I also think creating community level conflict resilience committees to analyze conflicts and resilience and to identify specific triggers and develop mitigation plans. I think that unless people are talking to each other, religious leaders, political leaders, community leaders, you're really not going to have that conversation that's necessary for us to move past this. And let David talk a little bit more about observation, because I think you've seen the majority of our elections overseas, so you know what you're talking about on that front.
I'll just
David?
quickly add, thank you, Donna. Just quickly add that it's true in most of the places that we work around the world, there is an established network, or a network is built of citizens who are doing their own observation with larger numbers, and they're covering, many aspects of the election process. And international observers come in and we liaise with them, we exchange information with them. We also can maybe help provide a perspective that's totally independent and outside of their home country. And in the United States, there isn't that kind of an organization or a network. There's groups scattered about that do some observation, but we saw this in our work in the Georgia post-election audit. There wasn't a large, Georgia nonpartisan observation effort. And I think the United States and states, individual states around the country, but the country as a whole could really benefit from stronger efforts at building the capacity and the experience to be citizen observers in an impartial, nonpartisan way. And then one other quick separate point, back to, I agree wholeheartedly with Andrea and Alan and Paige on some of the longer term problems. And I think underscoring a lot of this is the fact that Americans are really tending to live in separate realities and separate information ecosystems. And that part of our problem is to, ensure that we're no longer living in these information silos that I think just kind of reinforce some of the divisions and problems that we have.
That's certainly what we're seeing. Alan, I want to go back to that period between November 3rd and January 6th. And so I'm curious, how will events after that 2020 election during that period transform the future of elections, do you think?
Well, I think that the refusal of the defeated candidate to accept the results of the election and the fact that his efforts to spread disinformation about what happened in the election were supported by large numbers of his members of his party, members of Congress from his party, and also, and very importantly, by media outlets. So we had this disinformation being spread by online, but also on cable news outlets, on Fox News, for example, released by some of their commentators. So, I think going forward, what this means is that we have to be very concerned about not just the way the election itself is conducted, which we do need to be concerned about, but also about whether the results will be accepted or whether there will be attempts to overturn the results of elections. And that's what we saw going on. And we're seeing a continuation of that. There have been efforts in a number of states, for example, to change the laws in ways that would make it possible to overturn the results of elections, to allow, for example, state legislatures to choose their own slates of electors if they're not pleased or satisfied with the outcome of the election in their state. And that I think that's very, very dangerous. And I'm very concerned about that. And I would just say that we need to be clear about who is responsible for this. When we talk about polarization, we talk about information silos, it's one side that this is coming from, okay? This isn't coming from the left. This is coming from the right. The threat to American democracy and elections right now is coming from one side, and it's coming from one party. And I think we need to be honest about that, and we need to make that very clear to the American public, because that's the truth.
All right, thank you very much on that. Andra, I want to talk a little bit about the Georgia part in all of this. Elections in Georgia were vital to the national discussion around voting. It seems to still be voting, voter suppression, and transparency. And I'm curious on your thoughts on to why that we've had this focus.
Well, Georgia got a lot of focus because of the 2018 election cycle and because of the allegations of voter suppression that surrounded that particular race. And, in all honesty, there were, debates and controversies, about who had access to the vote, who was being registered, who was being prevented from voting. That extended even before that. If we look at litigation over things like exact match and other types of things, and the back and forth in the state legislature about whether exact match would be, legal or illegal at this point. So because of that, because of the closeness of the 2018 election cycle, and because Stacey Abrams raised allegations, one about the propriety of Brian Kemp being Secretary of State at the same time that he was running for governor, and because of, allegations about voter intimidation, about precinct closures that seemed to be really convenient heading into the 2018 election cycle, there was already this aura, this specter that Georgia was a state to watch in order to make sure that voting rights were protected. And so that only increased as we went into the 2020 election cycle. There were certainly other states that had sort of, low lights. We could look at Texas, trying to only have one drop-off box per county, regardless of population size or the geographic bandwidth of a particular county. But Georgia, certainly had became a lightning rod, in part because Stacey Abrams had helped to shine a light on what was going on here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think there are people who just think that was a recent focus, a spotlight on Georgia, and it does go back to 2018. And I think we need to think about that a little bit more. I would like to ask you, and I think there's a lot of interest within the citizenry about elections now. So what can everyday citizens do to help ensure safe, free, transparent elections, Andra?
So, I think one of the biggest things that people can do is to be very intentional about voting. And I think that that's an important thing. I love the turnout that we saw in this election, but it shouldn't have taken America descending into chaos through the pandemic, through the quest for racial justice, through President Trump's divisiveness to get people to be mad enough to do what they should have been doing all along, which was participating in elections. And what I hope is that we still see this record-breaking type of turnout, next November in the city of Atlanta when you have to select who the next mayor is going to be. And in 2022, when you're going to elect Congress, and in those lost elections in March that everybody forgets about because we're not used to voting in those elections. I want to see that same type of engagement. But as people are engaging, I think it is important for people to plan their vote. So Democrats use that kind of as a catchphrase, but I think that there's actually some universal truth there for everybody to be aware of. One, make sure you're educating yourself about when elections are. Make sure you understand what all of the requirements are in terms of the documentation that you need to bring with you in order to register to vote. If we're going to be voting early, do that as a means of, one, not procrastinating if you've made up your mind, but also allowing yourself the opportunity that in case there are any problems. So let's say you cast a mail ballot and it needs curing, that you're giving yourself time, one, to be able to be told that it needs to be cured and that you're being proactive in order to make sure that it happens. The final thing that I would say is citizens have more of a responsibility than just to vote. Part of political participation also involves engaging with our elected officials. And so if your elected officials are the ones who are sponsoring legislation that's going to try to restrict voting access because they're mad that their guy lost the presidential election, it's your responsibility, regardless of your party, to call them on it and to say, one, I don't want you voting for this. And if you do vote for it, there will be consequences because I will vote against you in the next election.
And we have a legislative session taking place right now in Georgia, and this would be an ideal time to do some of that engagement. Alan, I want to ask you if we can anticipate any problems in future elections. Are there things that you see we may see in the future?
Yes, some of it involves what's going on right now in the Georgia legislature and some of the efforts to kind of roll back some of the reforms that were put in place for the 2020 elections. So are we going to see efforts to make it more difficult for people to vote by absentee ballot? For example, requiring inclusion of identification with the application for an absentee ballot or with the absentee ballot itself. Are we going to see efforts to restrict early voting? Are we going to see efforts to take away drop boxes and things like that? I think these are all things to be very concerned about. It seems pretty clear that what's happening right now is that we're seeing some efforts, and I don't know how many of these are actually going to be come about, but efforts to make it harder for people to vote because, in the view of some of our legislators, too many people voted, and they see that as a problem. So I'm very concerned about that, but I'm also very concerned again about whether we're going to see attempts to question the results of elections in the future, as we saw in the aftermath of this election. We haven't seen anything quite like that. I was encouraged at least by the fact that after the runoff elections here in Georgia, that both Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue accepted the results of the election. They conceded. They didn't do it that quickly, but they did. They did concede when it became clear what the results were, and they were outside the margin that would provide for a recount. And so that was encouraging to me. So I don't know if there's anyone else around quite like President Trump who's going to engage in this sort of attempt to overturn the results of a democratic election. And if he's out of the way, maybe we won't see that again. But it's certainly something to be concerned about.
Thank you. Before we get to some of the audience questions, and we're thrilled that they're coming through, and please know that we want to hear from you. So put them in the chat. Let us know what you would like to hear from our panelists. But journalists have played a part in this, or at least there's the feeling that journalists have played a big part in how people perceive the elections. And so I'd like to ask all of you to maybe weigh in a little bit on that. How should journalists change or adapt their coverage of elections given what we know now? You want to start with you, Alan, since we just finished up?
Well, I've actually been pretty encouraged by the kind of coverage that we've been seeing in the media of the election itself, of the results of the election, and of the whole post-election controversy, and that at least with a lot of the mainstream media, with newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post, with some of the major news networks, CNN and so on, that they have, I think, done a pretty good job of just telling the truth and of making it clear. For example, when we saw these questions raised about how the results of the election were changing over time, starting on election night and then later, I saw just like every major news network that I paid attention to explain very clearly why that was happening, and that this was entirely expected, and there was nothing questionable, nothing questionable at all about what we were seeing happen, despite the efforts to call that into question. So I'm encouraged by that. I think we need to see more of that, and I think the news media should don't be reluctant to say when someone's lying, because when there's disinformation and misinformation out there, and I hope we'll see that continue.
Okay, Andra.
Well, there are lots of things to think about. I mean, I think, one of the things that we've learned from the Trump era is to be careful about earned media and how much earned media you give to candidates. My friend Eddie Glaude at Princeton opined that perhaps equal time regulations should be put back into effect, because that would have implications for that type of coverage. I mean, that deregulation also allowed for the creation of opinionated news sources in the mainstream media. And, that may be something that we want to sort of reflect on as whether or not that's actually been a good idea. I also think that it's really important in the 24-hour news cycle to think about, creating brighter lines between the sort of the news part of these news channels versus the opinion part of these news channels. It's something, I don't know if there need to be disclaimers that after 8 p.m. people are pontificating mostly and not always reporting, so that people understand. And I think it's important as part of civics education, to educate people about what people's roles are, sort of, what to look for, at 8 or 9 p.m. at night versus what's happening at 2 p.m. And also even on panels, who are the hired guns, who are the analysts, who are the people who are supposed to be impartial, so that people can be better informed about what's going on. I think also the other thing is, it's because this is a challenge, but, we have to avoid false equivalences, and also sort of having this sort of hazy sepia tone nostalgia about how, members of the press didn't hold folks accountable in the past. I have I don't say it's a bad habit, but I admit that I'm a little strange, and I actually prefer old TV to kind of newer TV. And so I spend a lot of time watching over air channels. And so I was watching one of my sort of favorite shows, which does a retrospective, a mashup of all of the CBS News. And they showed an old Edward R. Murrow report where he bucked his bosses to do an expose on Joe McCarthy. And the end where I'm listening to him say, look, I just gave you all of this information. It is our responsibility as citizens to stand up to demagoguery. It reminded me of the things that I've seen legitimate journalists have to do in the last couple of years. And so if anybody ever wants to tell you that, a Walter Cronkite or an Edward R. Murrow sacrificed any of their objectivity to call a spade, it was just really helpful to see that, and really heartening as a reminder that this has happened before, and that journalists are playing a really important role in standing up to it if they take their responsibilities seriously.
Thanks for bringing that up. It's something we probably... I'm sorry, I was unmuted for a second there, Paige. Let's hear from you a little on what you think journalists should do now.
No, I think every comment has been accurate. This cycle's really ripped the Band-Aid off our electoral process, and it has shown us how fractured it is as a process. But also, with people going down the rabbit hole of media and news, people have become their own citizen journalists. So you get online and you find yourself in this echo chamber that you have created through Facebook or Twitter, and listening to major news outlets report. I think they did show restraint this time, which we haven't seen before, because as Americans, we expect our results like that. We expect to know the night of who won. And as the results come in, and as reporting comes in from certain places, and the seesaw goes back and forth, it's really a whiplash of emotion for the viewers, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult trying to watch it and decipher what's happening. And so I think that journalists took that to heart. I think COVID has added the extra layer that everybody is attached to their computer screen or to the news. And I think journalists really need to recognize that their effect on the emotional well-being of people as they report is important. And so that transparency along with balance has become that much more important.
All right, thanks. David?
Thanks. I'll just add a very quick point or two. I do think that journalists did, on balance, a pretty good job in a very difficult year. But I would say, the challenge in this country is especially hard because of how unbelievably complicated and convoluted our system is compared to everything else in the world to get, to understand the election process and how results are generated. And so there's more that journalists need to do in this country to present to the public a very complicated process. And that's not the kind of thing that, journalists are necessarily going to think is, what's going to get them ratings and attention. And because it's so important that there's accurate understanding of election processes to build confidence and trust, journalists have an especially important role to play to explain this. And most of the places that we work, there's a single national election administration with a uniform process that's administered the same way across the whole country. Obviously, that's not the case here, and it's very, very complicated, and people need to understand it.
All right, but we want to get to some audience questions here. And this one came in early for you, Paige. What reason did the Republican candidates give for not endorsing the code of conduct for the January 5th runoff?
Thanks, Charles. I would say it wasn't so much a reason as a non-response. We consider the code of conduct a logical template for respectful behavior, and the standards we hold our elected officials to shouldn't differ from what we hold family members, work colleagues, or neighbors to. And that's what we tried to say with the code of conduct. The public and the Georgia voters deserve to expect at least that, if not more, from those that we send to DC. So I think it was the heat of the campaign. We got a response from two and not from the other two. And it was just, there was no reason given, I should say.
All right, thank you very much. Here's another question from the audience. What is President Carter's view, former president himself, on the recent events? Can either of you speak for him? Is he planning to make statements about what's happening?
Apologies. He actually has made statements. He made a statement on January 6th as to what was happening. You can find that on our website. He was really troubled by the violence. I will tell you that we were on the phone that day as things were happening. He had CNN blaring in the background, and he is watching it, and it's very disturbing. So I refer you to our website and his statement that he made that day.
All right, we'll check that out. Now, this question from Ambassador Charles Shapiro, and then this is for all, so whoever wants to answer it. Mr. Trump was quite clear since mid-2020 that he would not accept a loss and set up his later claims by asserting that early voting would be, by definition, fraudulent. So what should the media, the parties, the FEC, and nonpartisan organizations have done that they didn't do prior to the election? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll say that I think, again, I think that by and large, the media did a pretty good job of at least the mainstream media, what he calls the mainstream media, did a pretty good job of exposing the fact that those were fraudulent claims that he was making, that it was not true, that there was, so there's that. I think the other thing that we have to think about, though, is whether he should have been allowed to continue to put out that misinformation and really disinformation on social media. And I mean, we know that ultimately Twitter shut him down, right? And that was for inciting violence. But the question is, could social media and Twitter in particular have done a more effective job of trying to counteract the disinformation that was being put out? And I think it's troubling because I don't know what you do about a president or other public official who is putting out that kind of dangerous misinformation. And do you just take away their access, to the platform? Do you try to put out corrective information? I don't know what you do, because social media are so important now in spreading this kind of disinformation.
I think it's also important for us to take ownership of our own stuff, right? I mean, it was out there, people could see this. If you go back and read The Art of the Deal, there are lots of things that President Trump says in The Art of the Deal that he could have said yesterday, right? And you can see the sort of clear kind of consistency in, his arrogance, his belief that he's smarter than his own experts or his lawyers. And so watch, like, that's going to come out this week because of the impeachment trial. People could see this, but people refused to see what was in front of them because it didn't comport with what they wanted the world to look like. And so there was a lot of confirmation bias going on and people seeking out information that would just reinforce what they already thought. And so while I think, it's helpful to cut off the source of some of that, we also have to sort of be aware that this is how many of us operate. As psychological beings, and we have to do our utmost to try to combat that and to take ownership of that as well.
Paige, and I didn't know whether you wanted to say anything. I do want to let everybody know that you did put President Carter's statement in the chat. So, and if anybody wants to see it, they can see it there. Any thoughts on anything that could have been done ahead of time, David? If not,
just quickly say, I mean, I agree completely with Alan and Andre's comments. I think it's in some way it's a collective responsibility on all of us, because it was clear from a long time ago that President Trump, former President Trump, was going to try to make the claim that he wasn't going to accept the results. And that was an early red flag a long time ago, and it just needed to be addressed when there was no basis in that. And so I think it's not any one actor. I think it's really all of us needed to have done a better job.
All right, thank you very much on that. Here's another question. This is from Diane Yunkins, and she says she's a therapist and she can see how the media's style of arousing strong emotions fueled the division in this country. And she, any thoughts about that? Andra, I'm thinking you might have some thoughts on this.
So as soon as she said that, I'm going to recommend a book by Diana Mutz at the University of Pennsylvania. It's called In Your Face Politics. Yes, that's what they're trying to do. The people who are on the business side of this could probably argue that, look, it gets ratings. And part of, Donald Trump's, the arc of his presidency was to make it a big reality TV show. And so, whether it was ginning up conflict, having cliffhangers, doing all of these things, we have been bred on this. And so for somebody who's younger, like me, who would go home from school in the 90s and watch Jerry Springer for kicks, some of us have been pretty inured to that kind of thing. But on the other hand, like, we have to sort of recognize that that's not healthy, and it's not good. So we're going to have to take a little bit more ownership of our media diet, and recognize kind of what's happening to us and recognize our participation in it when we choose to consume it. And I think we're going to have to learn to be more savvy about how we consume information and how we consume the news. The other thing that's actually really important is, there's other work that was done by Kevin Arsenault and Martin Johnson that looks at sort of how we react to information that doesn't actually jive with our current beliefs. And so most of the time, the indifferent people don't pay any attention to the news, but those who watch have a stake. And usually when we hear stuff that we disagree with, our reaction is to double down on what we already believe. So we have to just sort of understand what processes are going on. And if we think that that's not good or healthy, then we're going to have to actually really consciously try to counteract what our natural reactions are going to be.
All right. Unless there's anybody else on that, there is another question asking of whether or not we'll see the networks such as Fox and CN move more towards the center. They're being seen as more left or right, depending on that. So do we see changes happening within the media?
I don't. I mean, I think that I think what we have with the cable news networks is that they've each sort of found their niche, their target audience, their business model that works for them. I do think it's kind of interesting, though, that what we've seen in recent days, some indications that Fox News and some of the other more extreme right-wing media outlets are being cautious right now about putting out disinformation in light of some of the lawsuits that have been coming at them, particularly from the manufacturers of the voting equipment. So, the threat of those lawsuits, I think, is very real, and I think it's already having an effect. So we may see some effort to pull back and be a little more careful about putting out blatant just misinformation if that threatens the bottom line.
Yeah, I would just add in that, as one of the judges said with the lawsuit, calling an election unfair does not make it so. And so I think as we enter the echo chamber that media tends to be in, the things that are the goalposts that they're running between is the lawsuits, as Alan just mentioned, and the viewership. And I think some of the tech companies and some of the media companies are actually going to self-regulate, perhaps more so than Congress will, on this verbiage and the use of the words that we see out there. And so I think that that's almost the checks and balance between the private sector and the governing bodies that we're probably going to see. I don't expect them to moderate too much, but I do know that there are goalposts that have been put there now, and they're not going past either one of those.
While we have you, Paige, there is a question on whether or not, as observers, whether you found it disturbing to monitor the U.S. elections. Was there a difference there for you?
I personally found it fascinating. I was in North Georgia and Fannin, I was in DeKalb County, I was in Fulton. And so I was able to see exactly what I saw, a year ago in Ukraine or other places that I have been. It wasn't disturbing because it was actually civic action in front of my face. It was people doing exactly what they do around the world, counting votes, holding their elected officials accountable to a process that's supposed to exist. So I wasn't disturbed by it. I found it fascinating. It was unfortunate that I felt that this had to be done. But I think as a nonpartisan observer, I really enjoyed working with the partisan observers who were there to make sure that everyone knew what the rules of the road were. And that goes back to the civic education component of what I think people need to understand how elections work and what election administration looks like.
I'm sure it certainly gave you a different view of things from to have it right here at home. David, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to tag on to what Paige said. I agree completely. I do think too that it was not at all disturbing. It was actually really refreshing for me and for many of the colleagues at the Carter Center who were involved, because in our work internationally, we see the value of the important role that citizen observation can make in countries all around the world. And it's a form of civic engagement, but it's also, an element of transparency, and it's a way to really have, citizens engaged and to try to generate data and information. We know these processes can always be improved, and you need good information. So systematic observation by observers who are nonpartisan and trained to do that kind of work can really play a great role in helping improve the processes going forward. So we were quite pleased to have this opportunity, and not that the Carter Center should do this around the country, but there should be efforts like this all around the country, because I think it helps build confidence.
So let's continue on that with this one question that talks about the U.S. seems to have lost credibility in terms of providing advice and assistance to election management, observation overseas. So given this, what is the message that we should be communicating to other countries heading into possibly their own contentious elections? David, any thoughts on that?
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things that we've heard for many years when we work around the world is sometimes people will ask us, well, it's great that you're coming here, but, is the United States such a perfect model, and why don't you do more in your own backyard and at home? And, we've always fully embraced and agreed with those comments, and that we should also be thinking about how to work at democracy at home. And we've never held up the United States as a model. While there's many great things about elections and democracy in the U.S., it's been clear to us for a long, long time that we have some fundamental long-term problems, both about campaign finance, about election administration that's not fully independent. Our decentralized system makes elections overly complicated, and most fundamentally, that there's way too many obstacles and barriers for there to be broad participation. And that's one of the fundamental standards and obligations, is there to be universal suffrage. And so the fact that in our country that there are too many obstacles that make it hard for every citizen to vote easily, to cast their ballot and participate, is a serious problem that it's been there for a long time, and we need to address it. And I think that will help us in our international work to be honest that we have issues here that we're trying to address.
All right. There seem to be a few questions involving, I know you talked about it a little bit, Alan, about what's going on at the General Assembly in Georgia right now in terms of the move to change the elections to the Election Integrity Commission that they've set up, and some of the bills that have come out. But there seems to be people want to know more about your thoughts, and maybe Andra, your thoughts also on what's going on and what we can expect to come out of what's taking place over at the Gold Dome.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know what's going to come out of it. We know what some of the recommendations have been, or what some of the proposals have been, and some of them are, I think, would involve making it more difficult for people to vote. I would say, however, and it may very well be that some of these don't end up being enacted, but I described this to someone the other day as an attempt by some of our Republican legislators here in Georgia as an attempt to basically fighting the last war. In that, a lot of this is focused on absentee voting, and the fact that such a huge proportion of voters, but particularly Democratic voters, voted by absentee ballot in 2020 is getting a lot of attention. And it seems to be sparked, despite the fact that there's no basis to the claims that this resulted in widespread fraud. This is kind of what is underlying this. They're building on that. But by the time we get to 2022 and certainly 2024, I think it's very likely that we will not be seeing as many people voting by absentee ballot. So a lot of this was, of course, a result of the pandemic, an attempt to make voting safer. And hopefully by the time we get to the fall of 2022, and certainly by the fall or even early in 2024, I don't think that's going to be an issue as much. And, I think my impression, when you try to make it more difficult for people to vote and put barriers in their way, a lot of times what you get is pushback, and you get even stronger efforts to mobilize and to turn out at the polls. So in the end, I am relatively optimistic that these efforts to restrict access to the ballot will fail.
Andra?
What I would add to this is, I always want to be careful when I talk about voter suppression. So not everything is voter suppression. So I think it's really helpful to delimit what is and what isn't. And so it might be helpful to think about it kind of as a 2x2 table. So there is intended voter suppression versus accidental voter suppression. So something that just has a disparate impact on certain people, and it may not have been intended to do that. And then there is voter suppression ideas that work, and then there are voter suppression ideas that don't work. And then there's stuff that would be on the outside. So on the outside, on the first day of early voting, if 200 people show up to a polling place to vote on the first day and they have to wait in line, that's not necessarily a fix. If on election day, white precincts are having sort of like average turnaround times of 10 minutes and Black precincts are having average turnaround times of 30 minutes, and they have the same number of machines and the same type of competent staff, right? We might want to ask what's happening. And it's more likely what's going to happen is that one district has like lots of machines and the other one doesn't. Something's wrong there, and we've got to acknowledge that. But on the other hand, when we're looking at some of these rules, like, when we go back and we talk about voter suppression historically, like we could talk about the obvious stuff like literacy tests and poll taxes and intimidation. But we could also look at some things like felon disenfranchisement. And the reason why we call that voter suppression is because there's an archival record that people have dug into that shows that people actually conjured up that idea because they were trying to suppress Black votes, right? They identified certain laws of, felonies because they thought that they were tied to Black people and that could get Black people, denied the right to vote without abridging the 15th Amendment. And I think the same thing happens here. All of a sudden, one party loses an election, so now they want to change the rules because they think that the other side did that. Ironically, before this election, before Donald Trump cast aspersions on absentee voting, Republicans were actually the ones that were more likely to be using this. So why is everybody paying the price for Donald Trump's strategic blunder that his party went along with that they should have ignored in the first place? We've got to ask that question and be honest and transparent about it and understand how to use evidence appropriately to be able to make claims about what is suppressive, or at least what was intended to be suppressive, even if it doesn't actually have that effect in real life.
Okay, we can't end this discussion without at least touching briefly on what's going on right now, the U.S. Senate impeachment trial, and how the outcome might affect future elections. So I wanted to get each one of you to maybe say something briefly about that. Can we start with you, David?
Sure. I guess the only thing that comes to mind is, it really, for me, well, there's a lot of things that come to mind. I guess the main thing relevant to the future of elections and democracy, though, goes back to this, disparate information ecosystems and how there needs to be a common understanding and reckoning and acknowledgement of what we have just gone through. And I think Andra made this point, succinctly at the outset, or one of our earlier comments. In order to go forward, we need to understand what happened and to do that honestly and accurately. And I'm concerned that might not be the outcome of what happens in the next week, and therefore we'll have a long-term challenge facing us as we go forward.
Paige?
It's not a very safe space to wade into. So I was hoping we could finish without actually talking about, but I would say that, if this cycle showed us anything, it showed us that democracy works. And although it bent, it did not break. There will be checks and balances. Many of us will not necessarily like the outcome, but it's a process, and I'm anxious to see the process go forward.
Andra?
Yeah, I think probably to conclude, because of polarization, I am not hopeful for the result. But on the other hand, in terms of holding members of Congress accountable for their own complicity in this, right? If people really do want to put principle above party, you have to hold your members accountable. Right? So they get away with what they're allowed to get away with. And so this may not be a message for Georgians right now, particularly for our senators, but for people who might see this across the country, you only get away with what you let your senators get away with. They'll only get away with that. And so just if we leave it at that and remind everybody to hold their elected officials accountable for their behavior.
Okay, thank you. Alan?
Well, I would say I certainly think that, given the polarization in the country, that for the most part, what's happening right now with this trial is going to just reinforce the predispositions that people bring, to the event. On the other hand, I think that there's still some possible beneficial results, even though it's very unlikely that the ex-president, will be convicted and barred from running for office. I just think that showing people very clearly what happened and clearly demonstrating the responsibility that the ex-president and his supporters had for inciting that that violent insurrection, as well as challenging the results of a democratic election, I think, you know, I think it has shifted public opinion a bit. I think that we see that a majority of Americans are very disturbed by what happened on January 6th and disapprove of the conduct of President Trump and his supporters in relation to that. So it's not everyone, but it's a majority. And I think that's a good thing.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for everything today. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, informative too. And I'll now turn it back over to Kristen Wooten.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you everyone for being here today with us. Great discussion. Thanks to Alan Abramowitz, Paige Alexander, David Carroll, and Andra Gillespie for your words. Please note that this event will be available to view online later on Facebook if you want to share, also on our YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about the Atlanta Press Club and learn about our upcoming events, please visit us at atlantapressclub.org. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.